lectures here in world history. Today we're going to kick off our unit on ancient Egypt and Judaism. Specifically today we're going to focus on the geography and early culture of Egypt, as well as talk about a time period called the Old Kingdom. Egypt was really broken up, its history is broken up into three main time periods: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. And we'll look a little bit more specifically at the Old and New Kingdom periods in this unit. So we've got two constructive response questions we're going to seek to answer by looking at today's information. The first question says, summarize the geography of Egypt and its surrounding lands. And certainly we're going to talk a lot about that. I think any different civilization we study, we have to talk about geography. To know who they are, we have to know where they are, because it's the where that shapes who they are. Geography really does matter in terms of looking at culture. Our second question says, describe Egyptian culture, including details on their government, religion, and social structure. So we will work in a lot of other details, but we'll also include government, religion, and social structure. So what will we learn? What's our roadmap here today? Like I said, we're going to start with the geography of Egypt. We'll talk a little bit about what the Old Kingdom period was and what really made it stand out, and we will finish by looking at Egyptian culture. So that's where we're going with all of this today. Let's set the stage. We know that Mesopotamia was home to the first civilization. We had talked about that. We've got the Fertile Crescent right in here. Sumer right in there was the first civilization. Talked about the city of Ur. But now we're going to take it a little bit further with the Egyptians. Egypt will be one of the first empires, and not necessarily the first, as we've debated that, but we know it'll be one of the biggest and best due to its unity, stability, and cultural continuity. Cultural continuity is a phrase that suggests that their culture for thousands of years really stayed intact through three different time periods in Egyptian history: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. You'll see a lot of similarities in their culture over that time. They changed some, but not that much, so we have cultural continuity. So we need to start off with the obvious. If you're not aware of where Egypt is, it is in Africa. We've got it right here in the northern, I suppose, a little bit more northeastern part of the continent. A little zoomed in version here. We'll look at several maps as we go along here today. But most of the ancient Egyptians focused their civilization obviously around the Nile, but in the north you've got the Nile Delta here as the Nile flows north into the Mediterranean Sea. We're also going to see the Valley of the Kings a little bit more south in a region called Upper Egypt. So that'll all kind of come clear as this unit progresses. So the geography of the the geography of Egypt has to start with the Nile. As we saw with Mesopotamia, we looked at the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Rivers really allow life to happen, mostly for the fact that it gives us water for irrigation, for farming, but rivers can certainly do a lot more than that. So the Nile River is their most important resource. That shouldn't shock us at all, certainly for fishing, for transportation, for irrigation, all of that good stuff. So used for transportation, irrigation, a little bit even for defense when you think about it. Sometimes rivers can be difficult to cross for large armies, so that can certainly work in your advantage. And of course, agriculture is one of the biggest ones here. The Nile is the longest river in the world at 4,100 miles long. You know, we've got a lot of other rivers. We've got the Amazon, we've got the Mississippi, and here even running through Minnesota and Elk River, but the Nile is much longer at 4,100 miles long. Just like the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia, yearly flooding brought rich soil that would be left as the water receded. This is very important because you relied on this for your farming. Most people, when they think of Egypt, they think of a lot of desert, and that's still very, very true. So you needed this flooding from the Nile each year. The Egyptians were so reliant on the Nile that in some periods in Egyptian history, they did worship the Nile as a god. We're going to find out the Egyptians are very polytheistic, meaning they have many gods, and it doesn't surprise us that their most important resource was often worshipped as a god. Now, one of the things that's really different from Mesopotamia is the Nile flooded like clockwork each year. Mesopotamia, they didn't know when it was going to flood. They knew it would flood at some point, but the Nile, pretty much you could kind of mark your calendars, maybe not to the day, but at least to a pretty small amount of time. So that allowed you to make preparations and understand when this would happen. Of course, you didn't know how much it was going to flood. It could flood a lot and still destroy a lot of property and homes and things like that, but at least when you knew roughly when it would flood, it would give you that ability to plan and prepare. That was not what happened in Mesopotamia. The Nile River flows north. That is not characteristic of most rivers. There are rivers other places in the world that do this. Most rivers do flow from north to south, however, so this is a little bit different. The Nile Valley is surrounded by sun-parched desert. We already mentioned this. We know that the Nile has a lot of desert surrounding it. In fact, excuse me, when we take a look at this next image, one of these next images, sorry, you'll be able to see that. I'll skip that for the next slide. Here you can see this is one map, kind of gives you an idea. There's the Blue Nile, the White Nile, and it starts at Lake Victoria and works its way north all the way through Egypt to the Mediterranean Sea. Now, here's the image I was talking about. So if you live in Egypt, it's pretty obvious where you want to live. This is a satellite image. Anyone who lives outside here is likely going to perish. So you have to live right along the green parts of the Nile here. And you can see the Nile Delta where it fans out and the water starts hitting a larger body of water. That's what a delta is. It would have been probably the best place to live because you have access to a lot more farmland and good soil. So an interesting look there at how important the Nile would be for the Egyptians. Now, three disadvantages of the Nile. Like we said, if it flooded a few feet less than normal, thousands would starve. That leaves you with less rich silt. So definitely you want a lot of flooding. But of course, that's our other disadvantage. If it flooded a few feet more than normal, homes and property would be destroyed. Again, you didn't know how much it was going to flood. You knew it would flood roughly. You knew about the time it would flood, but you didn't know how much. And of course, the other disadvantage, as we just looked on the previous slide, is desert on each side of the river forced the Egyptians to live on a small strip of land on the river. You know, it doesn't give you a lot of options in terms of where you can go and where you can set up your farms, your cities, your civilization. However, like we mentioned on one of the first slides, this could act as a natural barrier against invaders. The river itself could be a natural defense mechanism. If people are trying to cross your river to invade you, that can sometimes be difficult to do. Now, what's interesting is there are two regions of Egypt. Historically, Upper and Lower Egypt. Now, there's a map in your book on this, but I'll show it to you on the next slide. They're actually flip-flopped due to the way the Nile flows. So we've got Upper Egypt, which will actually be in the south, Lower Egypt, which will be closer to the Mediterranean Sea. And even south of that, you have another region called Nubia. Now, we heard a little bit about Nubia in Engineering and Empire. Nubia to the south was very rich in gold and was often subject to Egypt's authority. Egypt often moved in there, took over, because they wanted the gold the Nubians had. Obviously, with a lot of the tombs that have been found, gold was very important to the Egyptians. So let's take a look at this. So normally you would think in the north part here by the Mediterranean Sea, you'd have Upper Egypt, but that's not the case. Upper Egypt is actually in the south. Then you have Lower Egypt here in the north. And they're flip-flop because of the way the Nile flows. So you have to think of it that way. And then, of course, you have Nubia here in the south. Now, in its early days, Egypt was fractured into Upper and Lower Egypt as different kingdoms. That's going to change here as Egypt unites into one single kingdom. So a king named Narmer united Upper and Lower Egypt into one empire in 3000 BC. We know this because of the Narmer palette. Narmer palette is a stone with engravings on it, with hieroglyphics on it that showed how Narmer unified Egypt. So he is sometimes known as the Scorpion King, and Narmer creates Egypt's first ruling dynasty. And what he did is, you can see down here, we have these different crowns. This is the crown for Upper Egypt and the crown for Lower Egypt. And basically what Narmer did is he took these two crowns and he combined them. So imagine this being hollow right in the middle and this slipping right over the top of this I suppose it sort of looks like a Smurf hat, no offense to you, the Egyptians, but it's kind of what it looks like. You'd slip that right over the top. So imagine this crown with this white tip pointing out of the top. It would definitely have symbolized that person wearing that crown is now the undisputed ruler of both Upper and Lower Egypt. And Egypt would see 31 different ruling dynasties spanning over 2,600 years, and this all started with Narmer. Now, when I say he's known as the Scorpion King, some of you cinema buffs out there, the movie The Scorpion King with Dwayne Johnson, The Rock, is not about Narmer. It was just a made-up character that takes place in ancient Egypt, but it is not about the same character. So don't watch that thinking you're getting any type of historical accuracy. All right, we're going to end part 1 there. When we come back in part 2, we're going to specifically focus on the Old Kingdom and several different pyramids that were built there, as well as a lot of ancient Egyptian culture. So go ahead and hit stop and queue up part 2.